everybody, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. Thank you for joining us wherever you are viewing live, or if you're watching later, thank you for taking the time to watch today. I'm going to bring up Joan Hoff to talk a little bit about our services and programs that we have. So, welcome, Joan.
Um, thank you. I want to talk about some of the services that AFSP Oregon provides here in the state of Oregon and also nationally. But I think our premier area opportunity is the Out of the Darkness Walk. And that walk is a really amazing experience for a variety of reasons. And it literally is started as an Out of the Darkness Walk. So people started at night and walked through the night and came out into the light of the morning. And there's a couple reasons for that that was really powerful. One was that we want to take suicide out of the darkness and get it into the light. And also for people who are feeling depressed or sad, for them to have the opportunity to walk out of that darkness and into the light and find that there's services and support outside. So the Out of the Darkness Walk is a really powerful experience. We are again going to be live this year. There are 7 Out of the Darkness Walks in Oregon, all throughout the state. And there's information on the website that you can find the one that's closest to you. People find a variety of reasons that Out of the Darkness Walk is really powerful. One, it is a fundraiser for the AFSP, and AFSP is one of I think it is the largest funder of suicide death research and prevention research in the world. And they provide all kinds of wonderful resources like the one we're going to see today, the research that has been funded by them. And so that's a really powerful experience. And it also funds the other programs that we provide throughout the state as well. In addition, the walk has been really powerful for people who've had a suicide death in their life to be able to come and see that they're not alone, because there's hundreds of other people who've experienced a similar experience, and they have that opportunity to be able to see each other, to know they're not alone, to find support, to find help. Many times a team of people, so a whole group of family, friends come together, and it gives them an opportunity to honor the life of the person who died, and to get together to be able to do that. One of the most experiences for me is as we're standing in the crowd, everyone wears a color of beads based on the relationship of the person who died. And so for me, my husband died of suicide. So they have everyone who's had a spouse death raise your beads, and you can look around the crowd and you can see all of the people who had a spouse or partner who died. And it really is a powerful experience for folks. And and then the third reason that it's so amazing is that it educates the people in our community about suicide and the importance of suicide prevention and postvention work, so that we can hopefully get to our 2025 goal of reducing the rate of suicide, because that's our goal with this whole piece. So it's an amazing thing. Check it out. Love to see you at the walk, because I think you'll find it a really amazing space. Another program that we have on the last Saturday in November before Thanksgiving, there is an International Survivor of Suicide Loss Day. And that gives people an opportunity to come together and talk about, learn about suicide loss, and to talk with other people as well. We always break into small groups, and everybody has an opportunity to talk with other people. They may not know anyone else in their life who's had a suicide death. And so that gives them that opportunity to be able to talk with others about that. So that will be coming up in November. There's Healing Conversations program, in which if you have had a suicide death, you can apply for a conversation with someone. So they have been online or Zoom calls until now. We're going to be able to be back in person again. So when someone experiences a death by suicide and they just need to have somebody to talk to, there's a whole group of people that are trained that have had a suicide death that they get connected with, and they have the opportunity to be able to have that conversation, to talk with people, to get resources, to find out what they can do and what's available for them. And so that's another amazing program. And then the program that grabs my heart the most is there's a new program that we've just developed, or have just taken on, and it's called Gizmo Mental Health for Children. And it is a way to teach elementary school children about the fact that they have a mental health and what they can do to take care of themselves. And so it takes that stigma of mental health concept and conversation out of the darkness and brings it out into the light to say we can talk about our mental health. In addition to those are programs I wanted to chat about today, but online there are all kinds of other services. There are videos and training programs that you can bring to your community or to your workplace that help people to understand more about suicide. And hopefully with all of us working together, we're going to be able to get that suicide rate down. So those are some of the things that we're doing at AFSP Oregon right now.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Joan. And for those of you who didn't catch the website, it is in the comments, but it's just afsp.org/Oregon. So next up, we have Joe from the VA. So I will bring him up to share about some of his resources. Welcome,
Hi
Joe.
there, folks. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Hopefully, yes. Hi there. I'm Joe Bertnoli. I'm a clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and suicide prevention coordinator based at the Portland VA hospital. There are actually about a half a dozen of us overall that are social workers and suicide prevention coordinators assigned with our catchment area, which essentially serves basically the entire north half of Oregon, including Central Oregon, Deschutes County, and then about 6 southwestern counties in Washington State as well. And I'm going to discuss some of the resources that we provide specifically for veterans and also for veterans' families and loved ones, folks who care about vets, and folks who care for vets and serve vets in the community as well. And I'll talk about some of the things that we provide generally from the VA in terms of mental health, et cetera, and then some of the specific services that are provided by my suicide prevention coordinator team. And I'll give you some contact information as well. If you want to be ready to write some phone numbers down, I can make sure that you get that. Generally, one of the ways in which we are available for veterans that may be struggling with suicidal ideations, to be able to be there for them right away, 24/7, 365 days a year, is through our Veterans Crisis Line, which is partnered with the National 24-Hour Crisis Line. So when anyone calls the 1-800-273-8255 number, the automated recording will immediately say, if you are a veteran, please press 1. Or if you're calling regarding a veteran, please press 1. Otherwise, stay on the line. And therefore, if someone just stays on the line, it'll go, to whichever agency is serving with the national line here. So for example, it would go to Lines for Life here in Multnomah County. But if you press 1, it goes to our trained mental health responders that serve with the VA. And these are actually VA personnel that have access to the veterans charts and information just the same as any other person that is caring for the veteran when the vet interacts with the VA. It's an excellent system because, for example, if the vet is having a difficult time, say it's over the weekend, maybe late at night, and they call in to the Veterans Crisis Line, that responder that works with them can check with the veteran, ask them for their information. If the vet agrees, to provide it, then they can say, hey, I see that you have a suicide prevention safety plan, for example, that you drafted with, one of the social workers at the VA. Are you able to use your safety plan right now? Would you like to talk about using it to stay safe, et cetera? So it's a very coordinated care system that we want to make sure everyone knows about. Again, that's the 1-800-273-8255 number. And then if it's a veteran calling, or if someone is calling about a vet, they press 1 and it comes to the VA. Anybody can call the Veterans Crisis Line. Years ago, it was called the Suicide Prevention Line when we first started it. And then we learned that some veterans were saying, well, gosh, I'm not sure if I'm exactly suicidal yet. And I don't know if I should call because maybe, somebody else needs to call that's more suicidal than me. And we realized, absolutely, if someone is struggling with suicidal thoughts, we want them to call for sure. But we also want to help people that, maybe can be served before it gets so bad that they're really getting overwhelmed with suicidal thinking. And so we changed it to the crisis line so that anybody can call, and it doesn't have to be the vet themselves. If you're calling on behalf of a vet, or maybe somebody's calling with the vet with them, anybody is welcome. And we'll be there to help anybody who calls and help them get centered, get through the crisis, deliberate whether or not maybe the person needs to come into the hospital. And then what happens is the responder at the end of the phone call asks the caller, it's usually the vet themselves, may we give this information that you called to the local suicide prevention coordinators in your area? And they almost always say yes. And then that's a big part of my day every day, is calling back those veterans. We call back within 24 business hours to check back in with them and follow up and say, hey, I know you called the crisis line earlier. I'm calling here locally to check in with you and see how you're doing now, what more we could do to be of help. There's an entire array, as you might imagine, of different kinds of people that call. There are people that are already completely plugged in to mental health. Maybe they already have a psychiatrist. Maybe they're just having a really rough time. Something came up. Maybe the psychiatrist happens to be, on vacation or something, and they really needed to talk to somebody, all the way to folks that aren't even enrolled at all. And we need to get them enrolled, get them plugged in to VA mental health. There was a young veteran I worked with yesterday who was in terrible shape. He was crying when I talked to him on the phone. He wasn't even enrolled at the VA. And so we decided, he and I, that, after we spoke, that he actually was doing badly enough at that time that he should go ahead and come on into our emergency room at the Portland VA. And so I stayed on the phone with him. He came on into the emergency room. I helped him. He had never been to the VA. I helped him figure out where to park his car and get up to the front doors of the emergency room so that he could check in and tell the nurse at the desk that he had suicidal thinking. And so we got him all the way there. And now, of course, he is enrolled. It is important to know that our emergency room at the Portland VA is open 24/7, 365 days a year for any veteran. They do not need to even be enrolled. As I just mentioned in that example, they will get enrolled as part of that assessment, just coming on in. And suicidal ideation is one of our priority one criteria for admission to the hospital. So they will absolutely assess every veteran. They'll help them draft a new suicide prevention safety plan. Often the social workers in the ER will do that as part of their evaluation for the patient. And if the veteran is acutely suicidal, then they will be served by our inpatient mental health ward at the Portland VA, which is a place where the veteran can get safely stabilized, and follow-up for mental health will be scheduled. I lead a therapy group every Wednesday afternoon in our inpatient mental health ward. It's a suicide prevention group called our Wise Warriors groups, in which we either draft or revise new suicide prevention safety plans. Everybody's is absolutely unique to themselves. We just assist them in drafting those. And they are wonderful tools that not only list the professional resources that everyone can have at the VA and in the community, but all of the things that the veteran identifies that are helpful for them as well, specifically in their own individual case. The enrollment office contact information, if somebody does need to get enrolled with the Portland VA, is 503-220-8262. And it is, let's see here, extension 55069. And I'll repeat that in case you're jotting it down. It's the main Portland VA number, which actually is the main number for our entire catchment area, by the way. 503-220-8262. And then that same enrollment is for everyone in the catchment area I've described. 55069 is the extension. And then our mental health triage nurse, who is the person that would schedule a mental health appointment, is at the same main number, but their extension is 56409. Again, that's the mental health triage nurse. This can be for a veteran living anywhere in our catchment. They do not need to be in the Portland area. They could be down in Salem. They could be over in Bend. They could be up in Clark County, but the same mental health triage nurse will help them access care and get appointments at their nearest VA clinic. Again, that extension to schedule mental health appointments is 56409. Any veteran can call the enrollment office. Any veteran can call the mental health triage nurse and schedule. And then I just want to emphasize that we have an entire array of services. We have our chaplaincy service, which is wonderful about being there for vets and their families. They also facilitate grief and bereavement support therapy groups. And the chaplaincy, again, is available for anyone to call, including folks that are, people who have cared for vets. Again, the same main number, but our chaplaincy service is 57090. Again, that's extension 57090, and anyone can call them. And then I want to just make sure that you folks have my contact as well, my contact information. So as I said, our suicide prevention coordinator team has several social workers that are my colleagues. We have a direct, well, first I'll give you our extension. Again, it's the same main number, but extension 52857. Extension 52857, or we have a direct 503 number that anyone can call. So if it's a veteran that might need, information, if it's somebody in the community that would like us to come and do a suicide prevention outreach, a training for folks, we will train basically anyone anywhere in our catchment. There are veterans everywhere, but a lot of our information, probably most of it, pertains to suicide prevention for everyone, as well as the veteran specific information. Again, our direct phone number is 503-402-2857. If someone is in crisis, we want them to call the crisis line so they can be there for them right away within 30 seconds. And then they'll let us know that we can call that person back. But if it's not an urgent crisis, but maybe they're looking to find out information that would be helpful for them in taking care of themselves, maybe learning, how do I find out how to get a therapy service dog if I have, suicidal ideation sometimes in the context of my PTSD, that sort of thing. Anytime anybody can call us. And one last thing I'll mention, I referenced the Wise Warriors group that I facilitate in our inpatient mental health ward. We actually offer our Wise Warriors groups on the outpatient basis as well throughout the week, mornings and afternoons, different weekdays. Mine is on Friday afternoons, so I'll be running it this afternoon. And these are drop-in supportive discussion groups for veterans with suicide prevention safety plans. We talk about using our safety plans, ways in which we're taking care of ourselves, doing things to stay safe. Very interactive, very informal, interactive, supportive discussion groups. People find them very helpful. They're drop-in groups, so they're very easy for folks to check out. And I average probably around a dozen or so every week, just of veterans dropping in because they find it really, really helpful. And so any veteran that has a safety plan is invited. All they need to do is, again, just reach out to our team, say, hey, I'd like to check out the suicide prevention Wise Warriors groups, and we'll get them invited to the one that works the best for them. I think I've rambled on about as long as I should for the moment.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for sharing all of that. I did get all of those numbers and extensions and everything put in the comment section. So for those of you watching live or watching later, those are the numbers that Joe mentioned. If anyone has any questions throughout this program, or if you're watching later, please ask them in the comment section, and we'll make sure that if we can't answer them live, we will get them answered as soon as possible. So thank you again, Joe, for sharing that. And I'm going to bring up now our amazing team of researchers here locally working with the VA and OHSU to talk about what they're doing. So welcome, Jason, Avery, and Brandon. If you guys want to just go through and introduce yourselves quickly, and then you can go ahead and start your presentation.
Cool, sounds good. And thanks, Joe and Joan, for introducing those resources. Part of why we wanted to do that up front is that we know talking about suicide can bring up a lot for folks. So we wanted you to have all those resources up front in case you do feel distressed about some of the content we're talking about today. It's a general best practice we try to keep. So I'm Jason Chen. I'm a psychologist and suicide prevention researcher at our Portland VA and OHSU, and I use he, him pronouns.
Hey everyone, my name is Avery Liberty. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a research associate also at the Portland VA.
Hi everyone, my name is Brandon Roth. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a research assistant at the Portland VA.
Well, we're excited to talk with you today about some of our research looking at how veteran social networks are impacted by suicide loss. As we get started, we do want to acknowledge that our VA and the Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes, and how that history has impacted our tribal members and also long-term effects throughout our time. And encourage you to learn more about even where you live and the history of that area through this link here, which you can also see later. So I want to say these are opinions, so just note that. No conflicts of interest. And did want to clarify, we are funded by the Office of Rural Health through our Veterans Rural Health Resource Center here in Portland. We have a collaborative project with AFSP Oregon that is under review at AFSP, so fingers crossed for us. And of course, we did the work here at the VA in Portland. I want to acknowledge our veterans who are willing to share their stories with us and help inform this project and provide the information we're gathering in this project and our study team. And we've gone through a lot of resources, but just a general reminder, sometimes even though when we present suicide-related research in as safe a way as possible, it can bring up a lot. You already have gotten the crisis line a few times that folks have talked about, but no, we also have an Oregon Youth line as well. And both also are available via text. So if you don't really have too much time to write all this down, no, you can find all this online. So quick outline, we're just going to go over some background about our project, talked a little bit about how we did it, because, folks are like, how do you do this? And then some preliminary results that Brandon and Avery will go through. All right. So I first got interested in this and the concept of how suicide loss impacted veteran social networks, seeing some of these headlines out there that many of you may have seen as well. And especially noted this through this article, speaking of a Marine unit, the 27 Marines that have had multiple suicide losses. And there's a sense, really, we know that veterans experience suicide loss, and we know that there might be some groups where that suicide risk continues to increase among other members of the network. But we don't really have a good understanding of how that happens, and also how we can best intervene. Just to start off with some definitions, we'll be using the term suicide exposure because we want to think more broadly. We know not all of our folks who are affected by loss identify as loss survivors. So here we are thinking of folks who've lost someone to suicide, but it could also be involve folks who know someone who's attempted suicide or has suicidal thoughts. And we're just trying to think about how to make this a little more concrete. So here's a little figure of about 100 little folks. And if we're thinking about what percentage of veterans have had suicide exposure, mostly focused on loss, it's about half. So just to give you a sense, roughly 50%. It ranges depending on the exact study. The most common relationship we found in the literature is survivors report losing a friend to suicide. It's a range on whether it happens during their military career, and there's some research suggesting they also experience other forms of traumatic death. As you might expect, folks who have experienced suicide exposure have increased mental health symptoms afterwards. And it seems like in particular how close they were to the person they lost and how much impact they thought they felt were associated with increased suicide risk. And it's not quite yet clear how that might interact with someone's past experiences. More specific to what we do know about social networks, we have some research suggesting that if there's a suicide attempt within a military unit, it's associated with increased risk of future suicide attempt among unit members. And there's also been some works in school. And what was interesting in this study in schools is that if there's a suicide death in your school, students had associated increased risk even if they didn't know the person well, which speaks there might be other factors going on when we think about how our social networks can increase or decrease our risk. So our project in particular is focused on rural veterans. As you may know, rural veterans are at elevated risk of suicide, and our rural dwelling populations in general. And we don't really know very much about how these social networks are impacted. For our project today, we're actually going to talk about we're going to talk about a few pieces of projects. We also had an earlier form of this project looking at veterans who recently transitioned from military service. We'll include some of that data as well. So yeah, as I mentioned, we wanted to know, well, how does suicide exposure impact networks of veterans in rural areas and other areas? And then how exactly, what are some of the mechanisms? Like, what are the places where we might be able to change things? And what are the types of care that they might like? So here's a really messy kind of looking figure, but kind of long story short, really trying to dig into, well, how do someone's beliefs change after suicide loss? What are some historical factors? And also how the relationship factors might contribute to the degree to which someone may experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors after suicide exposure. So we're trying to reach 30 veterans in rural suicide hotspots in Oregon, still working on it. So hopefully we'll be able to come back with more info. And we're doing what we call egocentric social network analysis, where we are mapping the network based on the person we're interviewing with. And getting a better sense straight from them. So some studies do what they call whole network analysis, where you interview or survey everyone in a network. That actually works best when you know where everyone is. So for example, an entire school or an entire military unit. And we know when folks are out in the world, it's not always that clear. So we wanted to be sure we could be as accurate as possible and gather as much information as possible in a way we could do consistently. And second part, I'm trying to understand how suicide exposure impacts folks' beliefs. We did just more open-ended qualitative interviews about that process. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon, who will talk a little bit about some of our preliminary quantitative results.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Next slide, please. All right, so just wanted to give folks a little bit more context about our methods and sort of our approach to the data collection. So far we've been able to interview 5 veteran participants, and we asked them about their most recent suicide loss, as well as to name up to 5 individuals that they've been in contact with in the past month before the interview. You might hear me later on refer to those individuals as alters. That's just sort of the term of art in social network analysis for these folks when we're mapping a network. And then we also asked our participants about their relationships with these folks. So the 5 individuals, as well as the person who they knew that died by suicide. And so we asked them about the quality of those relationships, how frequently they were in contact, how they typically stayed in contact, as well as what they would sometimes talk about to do with mental health and suicide as a topic in general. Next slide, please, Jason. And so before I get into kind of the nuts and bolts of our social network analysis, we just wanted to share some kind of general trends about what these networks look like and who all were involved in these networks. So most of the alters, again, those 5 folks that participants named were non-veterans, as opposed to being veterans. And most of them were just kind of friends that they knew and had met throughout their life, as opposed to being family members or coworkers. And it was most common for participants to be in contact with these folks on a weekly to monthly basis, usually via texting or private messaging, but seeing them in person was kind of a close second there. By contrast, most of the folks who died by suicide who were members of these social networks were fellow veterans to our participants. And it was most common for our participants to have been in contact with them in person and on a less than monthly basis. So a little bit less often than the other folks that they named. Next slide, please. So again, like I mentioned before, something that we were really interested in was learning about the quality of the relationships in these social networks and really trying to get a sense of how these social networks might be a source of support for our participants. And so we asked participants to rate relationship quality on a scale from 1 being very poor to 7 being very good. And you can see there that the average relationship quality between participants in each of the 5 alters that they named was 5.7. Which is toward the top of the scale, toward very good. In contrast, the average relationship quality between participants and those that died by suicide was 5. So that's a little bit lower, but it's important to keep in mind that we asked participants about their most recent suicide loss just to keep things standardized. So for some participants, that was someone that they knew really well and that they had close contact with, whereas for others, that wasn't always the case. In contrast, the alters that were named were usually the first 5 people that came to mind with whom participants had recently been in contact. So with all of that in mind, it's not necessarily surprising to see this kind of small difference in relationship quality. Next slide, please. So we were also curious about which members of the social network participated in discussions on mental health and suicide with our participants. On average, participants discussed mental health topics with 57% of their network, but this ranged all the way from 17%, so just one other person in the network, all the way up to 83%, which would have been all but one person in the network that was identified. The most common topic related to mental health that was discussed was just kind of general life stressors, such as financial issues or maybe interpersonal or marital issues. Discussion of suicide as a general topic, including exposure to suicide, lived experience, beliefs about suicide, was a bit less widespread at 37%, but again, with a really wide range throughout our sample, all the way from 0% up to 83%. And then one kind of interesting trend that stood out was that there was only one participant of the 5 that we interviewed that described having discussed mental health with the person they knew who died by suicide. Next slide, please. So a common question in social network analysis is how densely connected a network is. By definition, density is the percentage of potential connections that are actual connections. So to make that a little bit more concrete, I think it's helpful to imagine a 7-person family reunion where everyone there knows everyone else. So if we made a social network out of that reunion, it would have a density of 100% because each individual knows every other individual. No one there is a stranger to anyone. So all of the potential connections among those 7 people are actual connections. On the other hand, if we made a social network out of a group of 7 random strangers on a bus where nobody knows anyone else and everyone is a stranger, that network would have a density of 0% because while it's possible for all of those 7 folks to know everyone else, if none of them do, then there aren't any actual connections there. And so you can see kind of toward the bottom of the slide there, The average density across our participants' networks was right in the middle of those two extremes, but there was some variability there from 29% and its little cutoff, but up to, I think that was like about 70% or so. And so, yeah, now that we've talked about some of these concepts and the data behind our social network analysis, we'll take a look at how we can visualize our participants' social networks. Next slide, please, Jason. So this network and the next one that I'll show have been modified from our actual data to protect the anonymity of our participants. So these are just to give y'all a rough idea of what some of these networks can look like. And I know there's a lot of information here, so I'll start by walking through what everything means and kind of giving folks an idea about what each of these colors and lines and symbols mean. So all of these circles are called nodes, and they each represent an individual. The interview participant, so the person that we interviewed for this study, is in the center there, and they're called the ego. That's kind of related to what Jason was talking about earlier, how this is egocentric social network analysis. So it's all kind of orbiting around that person that we interviewed. The purple circles are the 5 individuals that the participant named who they had been in contact with in the month prior to the interview. And the orange circle represents the most recent person the participant knew who had died by suicide. Some additional information, a light blue border around a node indicates an individual that had discussed experiencing suicidal ideation with the participant. You'll notice on this network that there isn't any node with a blue border. Nodes closest to the ego had more frequent contact, and the nodes further out had less frequent contact. So here that's shown on a weekly versus monthly basis. The thickness of the lines from the ego to each node represents relationship quality, with thicker lines indicating a higher quality relationship according to the interview participant. And the line colors represent a couple things. So they represent whether the participant had discussed mental health with that node, and also whether the participant reported that they would seek support from that node if they themselves were experiencing suicidal ideation. One thing you might notice is that lines between nodes other than the ego are dotted because we don't actually know about the quality of those relationships or the discussion topics that folks talked about, since we just asked about relationships between our participant and the folks that they named. Next slide, please, Jason. So some interesting things to note about this network. The density is a little bit over 50%. So roughly, 60% of the potential connections are actual connections. And you can see there that nodes 2, 3, 4, and 5 all know each other, which makes a big difference there. The person who died by suicide was somewhat isolated from the rest of the network, with only one other connection in common with the interview participant. This wasn't necessarily uncommon, and again, may have something to do with the fact that we are asking about the most recent suicide loss, and not necessarily the suicide loss that kind of hit closest to home for the participant's main social network. Something else that stands out is that average relationship quality was neutral at 4 out of 7, between very poor and very good. And perhaps related to those ratings, you might notice that there was very limited discussion of mental health. So there was only one other person in the network that the participant mentioned they had talked about mental health with, and also that was the same person and the only person they mentioned they would seek support from if they were experiencing suicidal ideation. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight about this network is that there were no other veterans in this network besides the interview participant. Next slide, please, Jason. So we mapped this network pretty similarly to the last one with a couple key changes. First, this participant had a wider range of contact frequencies. So on this network, that's shown from daily with the folks that are closest to the participant all the way up to monthly, the folks that are furthest away. The last participant didn't include any other veterans in their social network, but this participant's network included only one non-veteran individual. So the network is divided into a veteran sector on the left and then a non-veteran sector on the right. Let's see, next slide, please, Jason. So this network was based roughly on an interview with a recently transitioned veteran, someone who transitioned out of the military in the last year. So that might partly explain why all but one of the nodes they identified were veterans as well. Relationship quality on average was toward the top of the scale. And this participant reported having discussed mental health with 4 of the 6 nodes. They also mentioned that nodes 1 and 6, who were both friends from the participant's military unit, had discussed experiencing suicidal ideation with them at some point. In addition, the participant mentioned to the interviewer that they had also experienced suicidal ideation following the death of the individual represented by Node 6. Something else that stands out is that the participant mentioned that they would feel comfortable seeking support from 4 of the 6 nodes if they were experiencing suicidal ideation. And one other thing that I think is kind of interesting is that this network has pretty similar density to the last network. In fact, the network density is a little bit lower than the last one. But as you can see, that's really about the only thing that the networks have in common. And I think this illustrates that the quality and nature of the connections within someone's network are really important to consider in addition to the quantity of connections that someone has. And we kind of know this intuitively, that it's possible for someone to have regular contact with a wide range of individuals without necessarily feeling very connected with or supported by them. Next slide, please, Jason. So just kind of some preliminary takeaways to go with some preliminary results. There really isn't too much that we can say so far about the nature of social networks among veterans exposed to suicide. And we're continuing our recruitment efforts and hope to interview up to 30 veterans, like Jason was saying. So by that point, hopefully we'll have a clearer idea on what some notable trends and more concrete conclusions might be. Another takeaway I think that we can be pretty sure about at this point is that someone's social network is a very personal thing. And I think that was reflected in there being lots of variability between participants in terms of who all they named and what they talk about with them. And then the last thing that I'll mention is that you can't really tell from network analysis how participants and their networks were affected by experiencing suicide loss. And analyzing networks is, of course, no substitute for hearing these things in participants' own words. So with that, I'll turn it over to Avery to discuss some quotes and qualitative findings from our interviews.
Thanks, Brandon. So yeah, I'm going to finish out our presentation today by highlighting some of the qualitative findings from our interviews with veterans. Next slide, please. So just to give a quick overview and to reiterate some things that Jason and Brandon mentioned, we spoke to 5 veterans about their experiences with suicide loss. 2 of those veterans were identified through the rural pilot that Jason described, where we mail letters to folks in suicide hotspots in rural counties. And 3 of the interviews were from an earlier project where we used the same interview guide, all the same questions, but we reached out to folks who had transitioned out of the military in the last year. So we asked these 5 veterans about their most recent suicide loss, and this included relationships like a fellow service member for a few folks, childhood friend, and an old colleague. Most participants shared that this was not the only person they knew who had died by suicide, and most also shared that they have experienced suicidal ideation themselves at some point. Next slide, please. We asked participants about their general beliefs about suicide, and we really got a real range of responses. So 3 out of the 5 participants used some pretty stigmatizing language when sharing their beliefs about suicide, describing it as something that is weak, lazy, or selfish to do. When describing the most recent person they knew who died by suicide, one participant said, "He took a way out that hurt everybody but himself." The 2 other participants viewed suicide as just something that people do, even if they can't quite understand getting to that point themselves. And these participants did not use language that indicated placing any blame or judgment on the decedents they knew, but rather described choosing to die by suicide as something that was difficult for them to relate to. And I think this participant put it nicely when explaining this kind of perspective. They said, if they ended up doing it, they ended up doing it because they felt at that point that there was no other choice for them. It's not my choice, but I can somehow understand that that was their choice. Next slide, please. So in terms of reactions to death by suicide, one very common response that we heard across participants was surprise or shock. And this was a common reaction both for those that we spoke with and then also the other folks in their social networks or their alters. Some were surprised because the decedent just seemed like a very happy or upbeat person, and others were surprised because they just didn't think that that person would ever attempt suicide. One person said, "I know what they're going through for the most part, but I didn't quite expect that." Some participants reported feeling regret for not reaching out to the person when they had a chance and described specific times when they remember that they could have reached out to them on Facebook or in person just to check in, but decided not to for whatever reason. And participants also described feeling remorse for the other loved ones that were impacted by the loss. And another emotion we heard from folks who lost a fellow service member was feeling angry at their military unit leadership for how they handled the situation. One participant who knew of multiple people in one unit who died by suicide said, "I really started resenting that unit because clearly no one was looking out for them." Next slide, please. Thanks. As you all might expect, as we've talked about a little bit, folks seem to be impacted by suicide loss in different ways. For some people, especially those who had other mental health concerns or other things going on in their life that were stressors for them, the loss that they shared with us had a significant impact on their mental health. And in some cases, participants said that they experienced increased suicidal ideation after learning about the loss. One participant who was dealing with a lot of stressors at the time that they found out said, "It probably added on more than I thought it did." Another person said that the loss made them want to reconsider their coping skills. They said, "I think it was a serious indicator for me that I needed to change the way I was coping with emotional stressors." A couple of other folks shared that while the suicide loss was sad and certainly a loss, they did not report needing additional support to cope with it. So, for example, this participant said they were dealing with sadness, but, quote, "I would have to say I was probably doing okay with it." Next slide, please. So in terms of coping following suicide loss, one participant shared that they were really going through a lot at the time, and they were binge drinking and using work and exercise as distractions before eventually seeking help from a therapist. Many participants actually described talking to family and friends or discussing the loss with a therapist. And when describing this, one participant said, "I feel like it's better to let things out than to keep them festering inside of you." Other folks described practicing self-care with things like meditation, yoga, and taking time to reflect in nature as ways to cope with the loss. For example, one participant said, "For a number of days, I ended up just doing a walk down the beach. It was a great place for reflection for me." And next slide. So, while we can't make any sweeping generalizations from these interviews with just 5 people, as both Brandon and Jason mentioned, we're looking forward to talking to some more folks. But I think one thing we can say is that everyone is impacted by suicide loss in a unique way, and people also cope with loss in unique ways. So whether it's talking to a loved one or a mental health provider or accessing any of the many resources that we've talked about today, we hope that folks are able to reach out for help when they need it and to really find what works for them. And lastly, I'll just say thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and we're looking forward to hear your thoughts and any questions you might have.
Alrighty, thank you guys so much for sharing. It does not look like we currently have any questions in the comments, but if we do get some, I will make sure they're passed on so we get them all answered as soon as possible. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time today to be here and share these resources and amazing knowledge. And thank you for the research that you're doing. It really will help so many people. So I think that's all we have today. Again, if there's any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments and we'll get them answered as soon as we can. And if you ever want to know what we are up to at AFSP Oregon, be sure to check out our website at afsp.org/Oregon. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.